In 1912, a teenage bride survived the Titanic while her millionaire husband didn't make it out alive. Just a few years later, a Hollywood golden boy married a starlet whose life ended in scandal. So, what happens when two of the most talked about names in America end up tied together in gossip columns? This is the story behind the headlines that no one ever forgot. A privileged Brooklyn girl. Madeleine Talmadge Force was born on June 19, 1893 in Brooklyn, New York. She entered a world of wealth and position. The Force family belonged to the upper tier of society, and her childhood was shaped by comfort, reputation, and security. Brooklyn at the turn of the century was a place of expanding fortunes, and her family had the resources to give her a carefully arranged life. Her father, William Hurlbut Force, was a successful businessman. He owned William H. Force and Company, a shipping firm with strong ties to trade and finance. His career brought stability, influence, and prosperity. The family enjoyed more than a fine home. They lived in a way that kept them among the most important names in New York. Her mother, Catherine Talmadge Force, came from the Talmadge family, which was old and respected. Generations of tradition gave her a strong sense of etiquette and duty. She passed those values to her daughters, along with an understanding of how to carry themselves in high society. From her father came business strength, and from her mother came social discipline. The family home stood in Brooklyn Heights. It was a neighborhood of large houses, elegant streets, and views across the East River toward Manhattan. Prominent bankers, industrialists, and professionals lived nearby. Madeleine and her older sister Catherine grew up in an environment of refinement. Their days were structured with lessons and plans that prepared them for society. Madeleine received private tutoring. She studied French, music, literature, and the social skills that defined women of her class. Lessons in conversation, posture, and charm were considered just as important as academics. Her education was designed to prepare her for her debut, where she would represent her family's name and meet the right social connections. Social life began early. The Forces attended luncheons, dinners, and charity gatherings. Madeleine learned how to move through these events with grace. She practiced small talk, the proper way to enter a room, and how to leave an impression while showing restraint. Appearance and behavior were closely observed in these circles, and she was trained to meet those standards. The family's world included both Brooklyn and Manhattan. They moved easily between the two, attending grand balls and gatherings where families like the Vanderbilts and Astors dominated. Madeleine watched these occasions closely. She saw how introductions were managed, how alliances were built, and how marriages strengthened position and wealth. These experiences gave her a clear picture of how high society worked. Madeleine was noticed for her beauty and charm. She had striking dark eyes, refined features, and a calm presence that drew attention. Society columns wrote about her and her sister, placing their names among the rising young women of New York. Recognition in the papers marked her as someone expected to take her place among the leading debutantes. Her debut into society was carefully prepared. Dresses, jewelry, and partners were chosen to reflect her family's reputation. These events brought young women forward to be introduced to the city's elite, and they were often the setting where marriages began. Madeleine entered this world with confidence, shaped by years of lessons at home and in social settings. Her personality added to her position. Friends described her as warm and approachable. Her thoughtful manner gave her a presence that was admired. She managed the strict rules of society while still appearing natural and engaging. Madeleine's early life had wealth, education, and a family reputation. She was raised to marry well and maintain her family's standing, so her path seemed secure, directed toward a future of privilege and social recognition. However, her course changed when she met a man nearly 30 years older than her, whose name carried power and attention. The Young Bride and the Scandalous Colonel. Madeleine Talmadge Force was 18 years old when she met John Jacob Astor IV, known as Colonel Astor. He was one of the richest men in the country and one of the most controversial figures in New York society at the time. Their meeting seemed unlikely. She was a young debutante just entering high society, and he was a man more than twice her age, already seasoned by wealth, reputation, and scandal. Astor's life before Madeleine had already filled gossip columns. He had married Ava Lowell Willing in 1891, and their union was considered one of the great matches of the Gilded Age. Ava came from a respected Philadelphia family, and together they had 2 children. Their marriage ended in 1909 with a divorce, a decision that carried heavy social consequences. Divorce was rare among the wealthy elite at the time and was viewed as disgraceful. Families often worked hard to avoid public separation, and newspapers eagerly reported on Astor's decision. When Madeleine appeared by his side, the reaction was immediate. She was a teenager, barely out of school, and the daughter of a respectable New York family. Her father, William Hurlbut Force, made money in real estate and business ventures, and her mother, Catherine, worked carefully to place her daughters in the right company. Madeleine grew up with the manners and polish expected of someone in elite society. Her name was known within social circles, though no one expected her to attract the attention of John Jacob Astor. The difference in age between them drew attention from every direction. Astor was 47 years old when he began courting her. At nearly 3 decades older, he could have been her father. Newspapers wrote about the pairing, and editorial writers filled columns with opinions. Some mocked the relationship and others condemned it. High society reacted with unease, and the public treated the courtship as a scandal to be debated. Astor continued as he always had, unconcerned with the chatter. His fortune was estimated at more than $80 million, making him one of the wealthiest men in the world. He owned large real estate holdings in New York, including the St. Regis Hotel, and was also known for his inventions, writings, and public presence. Having Madeleine with him brought more attention, and he moved forward without hesitation. Their relationship soon dominated newspaper coverage. Writers speculated about Madeleine's motives, accusing her of seeking money and status. Others focused on Astor himself, accusing him of selfishness and irresponsibility. The New York Times and other major papers tracked their outings, from dinners in New York to visits in Newport. Every move they made was recorded, and Madeleine's life as a sheltered young woman ended quickly. She became the focus of one of the largest social controversies of the time. The couple married in September 1911, and the wedding appeared in headlines across the country. The ceremony itself was relatively private, yet reporters still found details to print. Their marriage became a statement. Madeleine took the Astor name and instantly became part of one of America's most powerful families. The response from family and peers reflected the unease already surrounding them. Astor's former wife, Ava, remained out of view. The divorce lingered as a source of disapproval within elite circles. His son, Vincent Astor, was only a few years younger than Madeleine and now had a stepmother close to his own age. Social clubs, gatherings, and private dinners filled with talk of the new marriage. The couple soon left New York. Their departure served more than one purpose. It allowed them to begin their life together while also removing themselves from reporters and constant gossip. They traveled abroad, beginning a honeymoon that stretched over months and took them far from the social pages at home. Madeleine entered her new role with composure. She had grown up in a privileged home, yet nothing in her upbringing matched the pressure of marrying one of the most famous men in America. Every gesture and every word from her carried more weight than before. She was no longer simply a young woman of society. She was Mrs. John Jacob Astor IV, and her name drew attention wherever it appeared. Astor lived as he always had. His wealth gave him the freedom to act without worrying about others' approval. He built properties, traveled, and followed his own interests. With Madeleine, he applied the same approach, taking the marriage forward with confidence while voices around him continued to talk. Their lives as husband and wife had only begun, and their journey would soon place them at the center of one of history's most unforgettable events. A honeymoon of secrets. When John Jacob Astor and his young bride Madeleine set off on their honeymoon in 1911, the trip was a celebration of their marriage and a way to escape the constant attention of New York society. Newspapers had been filled with stories about the 47-year-old millionaire and his 18-year-old wife. Their names were on front pages across the country, and gossip surrounded every detail of their lives. Astor arranged a long journey overseas, giving them both time away from the noise of home. Their first destination was Europe, and Paris was one of the most important stops. Astor spoke fluent French and had many connections in French society, which meant they were welcomed into exclusive circles. They stayed in grand hotels, attended performances, and walked the boulevards lined with luxury shops. For Madeleine, the experience was new. She had stepped from her sheltered upbringing in Brooklyn into a world of opera houses, glittering soirees, and fashionable events. Astor guided her through it all, introducing her to the lifestyle that matched his social standing. From France, they traveled to Italy, visiting Rome, Florence, and Venice. They saw ancient ruins, admired Renaissance art, and took rides in gondolas along Venetian canals. Madeleine was surrounded by architecture, history, and culture on a scale she had never seen before. She quickly adjusted to this new life, traveling from city to city with Astor leading the way. He explained details of the art and architecture as they toured, drawing from his own knowledge. Their days were filled with sightseeing, dining, and moving through the cities that defined Europe's grandeur. Their honeymoon stretched farther, taking them into Egypt. At the time, Egypt was considered an essential stop for wealthy travelers. Cairo offered luxury hotels and a glimpse into another culture. The Astors explored the Nile by boat, passing ancient temples and landscapes that had stood for centuries. They visited the pyramids and the Sphinx, and it is likely they rode camels as so many visitors did in that era. For Madeleine, seeing these landmarks created powerful impressions. She stood before structures that were older than anything in the world she had known back home. Astor shared the same scenes, adding Egypt to his long list of international travels. During this stage of their honeymoon, Madeleine learned she was pregnant. The discovery shifted the purpose of their trip. Their travels were no longer only about exploration and privacy. The focus turned toward returning to America in time for the birth. At the time, doctors considered long sea voyages risky for pregnant women, and families expected children to be born close to home. Madeleine continued traveling with Astor for a while, but the need to plan their return became urgent. Astor chose to keep the pregnancy away from public discussion. Newspapers reported on their travels in Europe and Egypt, but the couple gave no statements about their private lives. Public interest in their marriage was already intense, and Astor did not want to invite further intrusion. He arranged their journey home with care, choosing a ship that matched his wealth, reputation, and need for comfort. He booked a suite on the RMS Titanic, the most advanced ship of its time. The Titanic was praised for its engineering, speed, and luxury. For Astor, it was the obvious choice. For Madeleine, who was now expecting a child, it promised comfort and privacy on the voyage back to New York. Their suite came with private rooms, personal staff, and a promenade area for their use. Few passengers traveled with such accommodations. The Titanic was widely celebrated as the pinnacle of modern travel. It was seen as the safest and most elegant ship available, and its maiden voyage drew enormous attention. The Astors joined this group of wealthy passengers, boarding in Cherbourg, France on April 10, 1912. Their long honeymoon through Paris, Italy, and Egypt had ended, and they were finally on their way home. Or they thought so. Titanic, a night of terror. The night of April 14, 1912 began calmly for the passengers aboard the Titanic. The ship had been described as the height of luxury and safety, a floating palace considered unsinkable. Families, newlyweds, and members of high society spent the evening with music, fine dining, and games. Among them was Colonel John Jacob Astor IV and his young wife, Madeleine, who was 5 months pregnant. Their presence on the Titanic had already been noted because of the difference in their ages and the publicity surrounding their marriage. That night, their only concern was reaching New York. Close to midnight, the Titanic struck an iceberg on its starboard side. The collision barely disturbed the activities in the lounges and smoking rooms. Many passengers thought little of it at first. Crew members moved through the ship, but few people recognized the seriousness of the damage. In the lower decks, water rushed in quickly and began to flood compartments. The situation escalated within minutes. Astor guided Madeleine from their suite to the boat deck. Hallways were crowded with passengers trying to understand what was happening. Many wore nightclothes and carried valuables or children. Officers worked quickly to prepare lifeboats, calling for order in the freezing air. The evacuation followed the standard of women and children first. Astor knew his priority was placing his wife in safety. At lifeboat number 4, Astor helped Madeleine forward. Witnesses recalled his calm manner and his effort to reassure her. He asked permission to join her because of her pregnancy. The crew denied his request. Only women and children were allowed. Astor did not resist. He kissed his wife, let go of her hand, and stepped back as the lifeboat was lowered into the water. From the lifeboat, Madeleine saw the situation above worsen. Rockets lit the night sky as distress signals. No ships appeared on the horizon. The bow of the Titanic sank deeper, tilting the decks and sending passengers scrambling for support. Music from the band carried faintly over the sea as officers and crew tried to control the panic. Madeleine sat among women who prayed, cried, or held their children. She was not yet 19, expecting a child and separated from her husband on a sinking ship. The details of Astor's final hours are uncertain. Some survivors said they saw him smoking calmly on deck. Others said he assisted another woman into a lifeboat. What is known is that he did not attempt to force his way to safety. His body was later recovered by the cable ship Mackay Bennett. Evidence showed he likely died from injuries as the ship broke apart. He was 47 years old at the time of his death. Madeleine's lifeboat floated through the night. The passengers endured freezing temperatures as the ship disappeared into the ocean. Survivors later recalled the cries of those still in the water. The sound of many voices carried across the dark sea until silence fell. For Madeleine, each sound confirmed the reality that her husband was gone. The boat drifted until the survivors were taken aboard the Carpathia. When daylight came, the passengers of the Carpathia wrapped themselves in blankets and tried to recover from the night. News of Astor's death spread as soon as the ship reached the harbor. Newspapers reported the loss of one of the wealthiest men in America and the survival of his young wife. Crowds gathered at the docks to witness the arrival of the Titanic survivors and to see the widow of John Jacob Astor IV. Madeleine's life had changed forever. She boarded the Titanic as a young wife traveling in comfort with her husband. She left the disaster as a survivor of the sinking, widowed at 18 and carrying the child of a man who had placed her life above his own. A widow at 19. Her pregnancy was the most immediate concern. Before boarding the Titanic, Madeleine had been in the early months of carrying John Jacob Astor's child. With her husband gone, her pregnancy became the focus of public speculation. The press described it as the continuation of the Astor dynasty. For her, it meant preparing for motherhood without a partner. In July 1912, 3 months after returning to New York, she gave birth to a boy named John Jacob Astor VI. The child was often called the Titanic baby, a title that followed him throughout his life and tied him to the disaster that had taken his father before he was born. The Astor estate moved quickly to secure the future of the new heir. John Jacob Astor IV had written a will that divided his fortune among his relatives with detailed instructions for his young wife. Madeleine received an income that provided her with comfort and security. The will also restricted her choices. If she remarried, she would lose that inheritance. Her financial safety was bound to her personal decisions, creating strict limits for a woman still in her teens. The family structure added another complication. The older children of John Jacob Astor IV were close in age to their young stepmother. Their half-brother, born after their father's death, added to the unusual dynamic. Madeleine was both the mother of the youngest Astor and a newcomer to the family, present for less than 2 years before the tragedy. That position left her isolated within the family circle and set apart from those who had grown up in the Astor world. Public expectations suggested that she would continue to live a glamorous social life. She withdrew from that stage. After the Titanic, she rarely appeared at events. Reporters who once documented her activities had little to follow. She lived in private homes where she could raise her son in quiet surroundings. People who had once envied her marriage now speculated in silence. For a teenager marked by one of the most famous disasters in history, retreating into privacy created distance from the constant public gaze. Her attention turned entirely to her son. John Jacob Astor VI entered the world with privilege, though his future was shaped by the legal arrangements of his father's will. Every decision about his upbringing was tied to the instructions left behind. Madeleine centered her life on creating stability for him while following the limits placed on her by inheritance rules. The image of security presented in the press did not reflect the private challenges of balancing freedom with obligations set years before. Her withdrawal from society did not erase public interest. Newspapers continued to write about her, noting rare appearances and speculating about her choices. The title, The Titanic Widow, followed her, and her life was presented as part of the Astor story even when she remained silent. She lived with the awareness that her personal steps were interpreted as news and discussed as if they were public matters. At 19, many young women of her generation prepared for social seasons or the early years of adulthood. Madeleine faced sudden wealth, national attention, and the role of single mother to an heir tied to a great fortune. Her widowhood placed her in a unique position. She lived with financial protection and with restrictions that kept her bound to decisions she had not made. Her name carried more weight than her age, and her life could not escape the expectations attached to it. By the time her son reached his first birthday, her identity had settled into place. She was no longer the teenage bride. She was a young widow shaped by tragedy, wealth, and conditions written into a will. Every step forward reflected boundaries that had already been drawn for her, and those boundaries set the path she would continue to walk. Love without fortune. In 1916, Madeleine Astor remarried. She was still a young widow with the Astor fortune behind her. Her new husband was William Carl Dick, an investment broker from a respectable background. By marrying him, she gave up the inheritance she had received from the Astor estate. The terms of Colonel Astor's will were clear. If Madeleine remarried, the money and trust set aside for her would be revoked. People questioned why she would risk financial security, and her choice drew attention in society circles. The marriage did not bring stability. From the beginning, the relationship was marked by disagreements. Friends described frequent quarrels that strained the couple. William Carl Dick worked as an investment broker, and his career did not provide the wealth Madeleine had once known. Their lives were smaller than her days as Mrs. Astor, and constant tension shaped their home. Madeleine had lived at the top of New York society. As Colonel Astor's widow, her name carried weight, and her social standing gave her access to exclusive circles. In her new marriage, her position was different. The financial security she once had was gone. Observers who once saw her as glamorous now saw her more as a figure of sympathy, and, as expected, the marriage ended in 1925. The divorce left her in a vulnerable position. She no longer had the fortune that had guaranteed her place in society, and she no longer had the stability of a secure household. Divorce was still seen as scandalous, especially for women. For Madeleine, who had already faced years of press attention since the Titanic disaster, the end of her second marriage brought another wave of public scrutiny. Newspapers followed the case closely and reported on her circumstances. When the separation was finalized, Madeleine was left with little. She had lost her inheritance through remarriage, and she no longer had the support of her second husband. Her family remained connected to her, but her finances and social position were reduced. The young widow, once seen as the most fortunate survivor of the Titanic, was now living a life that carried far more uncertainty. The years after her divorce from William Carl Dick showed this change. Without the Astor inheritance and without the protection of her second marriage, her lifestyle shifted. She no longer hosted gatherings in grand houses or traveled in luxury. Her personal life became the subject of quiet gossip. A society that had once celebrated her as the Astor bride now regarded her as a woman struggling with strained marriages and fewer resources. William Carl Dick disappeared from her story quickly. His marriage to Madeleine brought him attention, and their divorce returned him to private life. Madeleine carried the burden of his name and the memory of their troubled relationship. Her decision to remarry cost her both money and stability, and it left her on an unsettled path. Madeleine was still young when the marriage ended. In 1925, she was in her early 30s. The press remained interested in her movements. She was connected to the Titanic story, and she was tied to the Astor family. Reporters followed her, waiting to see what direction her life would take. Years later, she remarried again. This next marriage drew far more headlines and brought her back into the spotlight. The boxer husband. In 1933, Madeleine Force Astor married Enzo Firmonte, an Italian boxer who later became an actor. He was more than a decade younger than her. Newspapers quickly covered the marriage because of Madeleine's history and Enzo's background. He came from Italy, had fought professionally in the ring, and had recently moved into films. Reporters focused on the differences between him and the wealthy family Madeleine had married into years earlier. Madeleine was already familiar to the press. Her marriage to John Jacob Astor IV and the Titanic disaster in which he died had made her name widely known. Even after his death, her life continued to attract attention. When she remarried William Vincent Dick in 1916 and divorced him in 1933, many saw her as a woman whose personal choices damaged the sympathy she once received as a young widow. Enzo was born in Bari in 1908. He built a career as a professional fighter and gained attention for his athletic build and looks. By the late 1920s, he began appearing in films in Europe. When his relationship with Madeleine became public, newspapers wrote about their age gap, his profession, and the social leap his marriage represented. Their wedding attracted major coverage. Madeleine had been presented to New York high society as a debutante, and years later she was still tied to the Astor name. Reporters described the ceremony with a sense of surprise. A woman connected to one of America's most prominent families was now married to a man whose career had been in the boxing ring. Enzo gained new attention from the marriage. Writers described him less as a boxer or actor and more as the husband of Mrs. Astor. Through Madeleine, he entered circles of wealth and privilege in the United States. His new position also meant that his activities, along with hers, were closely watched. They were photographed at resorts, at parties, and at events in Palm Beach and New York. The age difference between them was discussed constantly. Madeleine was almost 15 years older than Enzo. Social columns often hinted that the marriage was unstable. By the mid-1930s, reports of strain began to appear. The marriage lasted 5 years. They divorced in 1938. By then, public opinion of Madeleine had grown more critical. She was often described in the press as unable to manage her personal life. Earlier sympathy for her role in the Titanic story had faded, and repeated marriages and divorces gave writers material to portray her as restless and unreliable. Madeleine's financial situation also came under discussion. She had inherited a large trust from John Jacob Astor IV, but the conditions tied to remarriage reduced her independence. Every new union affected her income. By the end of her marriage to Enzo, her financial security was weaker than it had been as a young widow in 1912. Enzo continued his career after the divorce. He appeared in films and remained active in public life both in America and Europe. Journalists continued to describe him as Madeleine's former husband, a label that followed him for years. On the other hand, Madeleine's reputation also did not recover. In the 1930s, women in her position were expected to project stability. Her multiple marriages and divorces made her a frequent subject in gossip columns. Writers emphasized her instability rather than her survival of past tragedies. The marriage to Enzo gave reporters a story that fit well into their coverage of high society. They highlighted the unusual pairing, the short-lived union, and the consequences for both partners. Readers followed the details closely, but over time the story faded. By 1938, other scandals and celebrity news began to dominate. The wild Pickford brother. Jack Pickford was the younger brother of Mary Pickford, who had already become one of the biggest names in Hollywood. While Mary worked tirelessly to shape her image as America's sweetheart, Jack gained attention for very different reasons. He was often in the headlines not for his acting roles, but for the way he lived his life off-screen. Hollywood quickly saw him as the reckless member of the Pickford family. Jack did have a film career of his own. He appeared in a number of movies, often playing lighthearted or boyish roles that matched his youthful appearance, but his work in front of the camera was never enough to make him a star on the level of his sister. What really made him stand out was his behavior behind the scenes. He became known for wild parties, heavy drinking, and a lifestyle that often left him in the gossip pages. Studios tolerated him because of his famous last name, but his reputation for excess followed him wherever he went. His personal life was just as public. Jack married Olive Thomas, a rising star who had made her name as a Ziegfeld Follies performer before moving into silent films. The two of them became one of the most talked about couples in Hollywood. Their marriage was passionate but also stormy, with reports of frequent fights and separations. Despite the problems, they were often seen together at parties, creating a glamorous image of youth and success. That image collapsed in 1920 during a trip to Paris. Olive Thomas died after ingesting poison at the Hotel Ritz, and the circumstances immediately drew international attention. The story dominated newspapers, both in the United States and abroad. Some reports suggested that Olive had taken the poison by accident, while others hinted at more troubling possibilities. Because Jack had been with her that night, his name was tied to the tragedy from the beginning. The scandal surrounding Olive's death overshadowed Jack's career. Even though official reports cleared him of wrongdoing, the public continued to connect his name to the story. Hollywood insiders whispered about what had really happened in Paris, and gossip writers speculated endlessly. For Jack, the association with Olive's death became impossible to escape. After Paris, his reputation took a permanent hit. He still appeared in films, but audiences paid more attention to his off-screen life than his work as an actor. The combination of his hard-partying image and the shadow of Olive's death made him one of the most notorious figures in the industry. While his sister Mary was celebrated as the model of success and respectability, Jack carried a reputation built on scandal and loss. In many ways, Jack's story ran parallel to Madeleine's. Both came from privilege, both captured public fascination, and both saw their lives unravel in ways that kept them forever tied to loss and gossip. What he was to Hollywood, she was to New York society, two figures from different worlds, yet marked by the same fate of scandal and decline. It was this strange connection that gossip writers picked upon. To the tabloids, Madeleine was forever the Titanic heiress, and Jack the scandal-stained widower. Their names began to appear side by side in society columns. The heiress and the murderer. They had little in common on the surface. Madeleine was from a wealthy East Coast family, while Jack came from the world of Hollywood. Yet editors and reporters placed them side by side in stories that traded on scandal and tragedy. The link was simple. Both were young, both had been married to famous spouses who died in dramatic circumstances, and both lived under the weight of those reputations. Madeleine's image as the Titanic widow carried an air of frozen time. To the public, she was forever the 19-year-old bride who stepped into a lifeboat while her husband remained behind. Journalists repeated that detail so often that her later life seemed secondary. When she remarried and tried to live privately, the press still described her as Astor's widow first and a wife or mother second. Her name had become shorthand for survival, wealth, and tragedy combined. Jack Pickford's image followed a different path. He had grown up in Hollywood during the rise of the movie industry, where gossip could be as damaging as it was profitable. His reputation became tied to excess, rumors of heavy drinking, and his tragic connection to Olive Thomas. Every mention of his name brought back the circumstances of her death in Paris. Even when he appeared in films or attended public events, headlines circled back to Olive's poisoning and the scandal that surrounded it. Jack became an example of how Hollywood could consume its own. The press thrived on building narratives around recognizable figures, and pairing Madeleine and Jack gave them ready-made copy. She symbolized high society touched by loss. He symbolized Hollywood ruined by vice and tragedy. Together, they created an easy contrast for gossip writers to exploit. Stories rarely suggested that the two had much interaction, but their names side by side suggested a kind of unspoken connection. Readers saw them as representatives of a generation marked by sudden and public misfortune. By the late 1920s, both had grown tired of their reputations. Madeleine tried to distance herself from the constant reminders of the Titanic. She remarried, raised children, and tried to live away from the spotlight. But her efforts never erased the headline attached to her name. Every social appearance, every legal dispute, every mention of her life circled back to Astor and the Titanic. Jack, on the other hand, leaned into his notoriety. Hollywood parties, reckless spending, and health problems filled his later years. Journalists described him less as a leading man and more as a cautionary tale. Their names continued to appear together in society columns well into the 1930s. The stories no longer needed a fresh scandal to make an impact. By then, the weight of memory itself was enough. Readers already knew the outlines of Madeleine's life as the Titanic widow and Jack's life as Olive Thomas's widower. Each new article simply reinforced the roles they had been assigned. They were treated less like individuals and more like symbols of tragedy, carried forward year after year. Madeleine and Jack belonged to different worlds, but in public memory, their reputations worked in parallel. Both were defined by events that happened early in their lives. Both struggled to escape the shadows those events cast, and both saw their later years shaped less by personal choices and more by how the press and public remembered their pasts. By the end of their lives, Madeleine and Jack had reputations that rested on loss and scandal. Madeleine remained tied to the Titanic, while Jack remained tied to Olive Thomas. Neither fully escaped the headlines that had followed them since their youth. A life overshadowed. Madeleine Force Astor lived through some of the most dramatic chapters of early 20th century society. Yet her final years were far quieter than the headlines that had once followed her everywhere. In later decades, her health began to decline, and by the time she reached her mid-40s, her body carried the toll of years lived under constant attention and strain. On March 27, 1940, she died in Palm Beach, Florida, at only 46 years old. The cause was reported as heart complications, a condition that had been affecting her for some time. Her passing was a reminder that even those who once seemed large were not spared from the frailty of the body. The news of her death was reported widely in the press. Society pages that had once detailed her gowns, parties, and marriages now carried accounts of her final illness and quiet end. In the weeks before her passing, she had been under medical care, and those closest to her understood that her health had grown fragile. Unlike the spectacles of her earlier life, her final chapter unfolded without public drama. She was surrounded by those in her private circle, and the public learned of her death only after it had occurred. For a woman whose life had been measured out in newspaper columns, the subdued nature of her final days stood apart from the whirlwind of her youth. Madeleine's funeral was held in New York, where the Astor name carried deep history. Friends, family, and acquaintances attended, paying respects not just to a woman who had once been a public figure, but to someone they had known in private. The service reflected her position as a member of an old and prominent family, yet it was intimate compared to the grand spectacles of her early married life. Burial arrangements placed her within the same world of privilege she had been born into, a reminder of how firmly she remained tied to the circles of her upbringing. 7 years earlier, another life had already come to an end. Jack Pickford, once a young star of silent films and the younger brother of Mary Pickford, had lived a restless life that left deep marks on his health. He died in Paris on January 3, 1933, at only 36 years old. Reports listed multiple health issues as contributing factors, including complications from syphilis and years of heavy drinking. His health had been in decline for a long period, and his body could no longer withstand the damage. The end came in a hotel room far from Hollywood, where his career had once flourished. The announcement of Jack's death reached back across the Atlantic, where American papers reported on the final chapter of the Pickford brothers. In his last years, he had moved between film projects, restless travels, and attempts to recover some sense of stability. Yet his health remained fragile, and those who had known him personally were not surprised when the news of his passing arrived. His funeral was held in Los Angeles, attended by members of his family and close friends. The service, though simple, drew attention because of the Pickford name, which still carried weight in Hollywood. His body was interred in Forest Lawn Memorial Park, a resting place that would later become known for housing many figures of the film industry. Jack's death closed the chapter on a turbulent life that had begun with promise in the early silent film era. He had enjoyed opportunities that came with being part of a famous family, but his struggles with health and lifestyle prevented him from ever fully settling into the stability that others around him managed to hold. His death at such a young age reinforced how quickly a life could unravel once the body began to give way. When paired side by side, the deaths of Madeleine Force Astor and Jack Pickford illustrated how fragile life could be for people who had once seemed at the center of society and entertainment. Both were still young by the standards of today, 46 and 36, and both had been shaped by the intense pressures of public attention, marriages that carried enormous weight, and years of personal strain. Their final illnesses were quiet in their own ways, far from the spotlight that had once followed them. What remained at the end was the simple reality of two individuals whose bodies could no longer carry the burdens of their pasts. Two lives ended too soon, but their stories still grab attention even today. If you liked this video into their scandals and tragedies, hit that like button, share it with a friend, and don't forget to subscribe for more hidden stories from history's most talked about figures.